Thank you all for joining us and for coming back from that delightfully extended open range session that we had. I hope everybody has stretched their legs well and is ready to settle in with some snacks for a little afternoon entertainment. We are going to be talking about food innovation and the new strategy that you probably need. To get us started with a little bit of levity, I've got a quote here from a TV show that I love on NBC called The Good Place. And the premise is irrelevant to the quote, and if you do like the show, don't spoil it for your neighbor and give away the twists. All you really need to know is Ted Danson's character Michael is not a human, but he's fascinated by them. And he says very early on in the show, I really like frozen yogurt. There's something so human about taking something great and ruining it just a little bit so you can have more. And I chuckled, and I hear some chuckles, and it's definitely a case of art imitating life. It really hit home for me because I think it describes the current state of food innovation really accurately. And it describes the sort of stressful nature of food innovation very accurately, in that a lot of food innovation today is about taking something good, something guilty, something sweet or fatty, and removing some of that guilt, and you have to compromise a bit of the experience in the process. So you ruin something a little so that you can feel less guilty and have more of it. So food innovation today is really a race to the precipice of awful to try to make your product as indulgible as possible for minimal guilt, without going over the edge into something that tastes truly terrible and then no one wants to eat any of it. And to help illustrate that point, I'd like to talk about a real-life example. So, show of hands. How many people have tried this product, Halo Top Light Ice Cream? Okay, number of hands. Of those of you who have raised your hands, how many of you, bite for bite, prefer this to real ice cream? Ben & Jerry's, Haagen-Dazs, what have you? Anyone? One hand in the back of the room. All right. Now, for those of you who haven't tried it, if I told you that you could eat an entire pint of this ice cream for fewer calories than one of those cookies that many of us just indulged in, maybe it would change your mind. But then maybe you would try it and you would taste what I tasted, that it's chalky. It's sweetened with a sweetener they use in gum. It has kind of a cooling, minty aftertaste. It's too firm. It's not quite fluffy enough. It's just not satisfying. It's obviously, objectively, for everyone except one person in the back, not as good as ice cream. And yet, it's outselling the leading brand of ice cream in the US today. This awful concoction is actually selling better than the best ice cream in the country. So at some point, I have to put my preference aside and acknowledge commercial success. This company has Unilever so scared that they're advertising for their new competitive light ice cream on pages where people are searching for Halo Top. This may have been a little upstart that was just on the scene about 3 years ago, but it's outselling Ben & Jerry's, and Unilever, which owns Ben & Jerry's, has taken notice. And this helps describe the current state of food innovation today, which is that it is stressful, terribly, terribly stressful. You have a race to the edge of awful. You have little tiny brands that pop up out of nowhere and take your sales. It's a tough situation to try to innovate in. I do have a little bit of good news. Part of the reason it's so stressful is that the data you are relying on are lagging indicators, they're qualitative, and it's fragmented data. And this is the part that's good news. This is a data problem. I'm not up here to say your new strategy for food innovation needs to be better search engine optimization, or seeing if George Clooney's available, or hiring a team of folks fresh out of college to do a social media marketing genius campaign and get you 1 million Instagram followers. It's not that solution. This is a data problem, and the way we're going to solve it is with a data solution. We need to get better data in the form of leading indicators, more quantitative data, and a centralized mechanism so that you can actually derive insights from the data that you're gathering. Now, I don't want to give away the punchline, but for anyone planning to attend Mike Rolfe's session tomorrow, you will hear from him a lot about strategies for using the data that you're already collecting in a number of different cases, and food is no different. We need to actually use these data. I want to talk a little bit about the different types of data that are so stressful. And I'd like to start with those lagging indicators. So sales data are too little, too late. If you really want sales data on your idea to know whether it was a good idea, you need to create the idea, formulate it, produce it, package it, distribute it, sell it, and then wait 6 to 12 months. And then you'll know, was it a good idea? In the interim, your competitors may have moved ahead. There may be extenuating circumstances that are happening in society that are going to impact the sales now that might not stand true in the future, and so on. It's just a terrible data point to make decisions based on. It also makes it very difficult to have any predictive value for what's coming next. So for example, if we look at US ice cream sales by brand in 2017, you can see that the field is dominated by brands owned by Unilever and Nestle. So these are really the leaders in the US ice cream industry. And the challenge is, in 2015, Halo Top sales, as part of this private label piece, in 2015, they were way down here off the bottom of the graph at $40 million. It's a blip. It's hardly anything. And yet, they're currently outselling Ben & Jerry's. So can you wait until a newcomer is taking market share before you notice their presence? In 2017, Graeme Pitt-Keithley, who is the finance director at Unilever, was quoted in the Financial Times saying, Halo Top has very, very quickly taken 1.5 points from us. Unilever was getting ready to buy Halo Top for $2 billion, which is way more than any reasonable multiple of their sales, and is more than Unilever's exposure in the US ice cream market in any year already. They were going to have to make a massive outlay of cash because of a significant competitor that came from nowhere. And sales data didn't point that out at all. It's far too lagging an indicator. The next thing I mentioned was qualitative data. Focus group data is a great example of qualitative data that's a problem. They're qualitative, they're also not comprehensive as data go. To help me illustrate that point, I would like to talk about a lesser known side of a well-known problem. We've all heard this story of the very, very noisy compostable Sun Chips bag. In fact, I bet most of the folks in the room have used this example at some point or another. For those of you that may be less aware, this product was made compostable by swapping out one of the polymers typically used for another one that has a higher glass transition temperature above room temperature, meaning if the bag was at room temp and you crinkled it, it would essentially be like crinkling a pane of glass rather than a soft piece of plastic, which is why it was so loud. But during the focus group sessions that the consulting firm that they hired did, a number of the participants reported quotes like, "This bag makes me feel better about buying Sun Chips over other brands. And it's crinkly, but I'm an environmentally conscious consumer. So I'm going to tolerate the louder bag if I know that it's green." Now, these quotes were buried in the back of a deck in a nice-to-have section because one of the consultants had made the value judgment that these statements were not as relevant as other statements. Not only were they qualitative data, but someone else had made a judgment about whether they were important. So they unleashed the bag on the world. And then some of those same participants, no doubt, went into a meeting or were late to a lecture in school or something and tried to very quietly pull a bag out of their bag and open it. And chaos ensued, to the tune of videos recording 95 decibels, crinkling the bag at room temperature, Facebook groups decrying how terrible and awful it was, and even Wolf Blitzer had to get into the action on CNN and talk about how loud the bag was and the chaos it was creating. Most of this could have been solved by the Sun Chips company assessing the noise volume, the noise level the bag made at room temp, and simply measuring it and registering 95 decibels would have been enough for any reasonable person to go, oh boy, we need to do something different here. So this was a very expensive, very painful mistake they've since recovered from. The third challenge that I mentioned is the challenge around fragmented data. And I think if we look at the way teams interact together, it can illustrate the challenge with fragmented data. So let's say you've got a marketing team, a formulation team, a sensory team, and a design team. And let's say you're addressing the need for sugar reduction in ice cream, for example. So maybe your marketing team comes in and says, guys, we need sugar reduction. The formulation team goes, okay, cool. We took it out. We use sucralose. Ta-da, we're done. Sensory, gee, that product's not fluffy anymore. The experience is gone. Let's just do some magic. Take out the calories for me. I don't need any of that crazy stuff. Marketing comes along and says, well, while you're at it, our closest competitor is using stevia so they can make a natural claim on the label. So while you're already reformulating for sensory, can you just use stevia instead? Formulation goes back to the drawing board. They come back a while later and they say, okay, great. Turns out stevia from a plant tastes terrible. Bitter, metallic, no good. But we found a synbio version. It tastes great, all good. We used that. We added dextrose for some fluff. Everybody's happy. Sensory's on board. And then your design team comes in and says, hey, guys, we need to have a meeting and figure out how you want the label to look different because we can't use the non-GMO project verified label anymore, thanks to that synbio stuff. And then your marketing team has a conniption and says, oh, okay, nobody said anything about GMOs, back away slowly. We were trying to make a natural claim. We need to go back to the drawing board. I'm guessing this is a familiar and somewhat painful example for a number of the folks in the room, probably in food and in other areas. So how are you supposed to work efficiently with decentralized data? No wonder things are so hard. As I mentioned, think of this as a mantra. Help to calm you down in the middle of this very stressful situation, right? This is a data problem. It has a data solution. And real progress is going to take an integrated approach that we call ingredient informatics. Ingredient informatics is a concept we're going to borrow from a couple of other industries. We're going to borrow from building information modeling systems in the building world, and we're borrowing from the materials informatics concepts of using data science and artificial intelligence to take information about the materials you have and use it to inform decisions about redesigning materials more quickly, more efficiently, and more cost-effectively. We're going to combine those things into a three-part strategy using quantitative data, using a centralized data platform, and then mining that platform and mining that existing portfolio of ingredients that you already have access to. Let's start with quantitative data. One of the most important places to get quantitative is sensory data. Those almost intangible aspects of food that are so relevant to the consumer experience. Mouthfeel, texture, and so on. And I know that that's difficult, and most of the time we rely on sensory experts, we rely on these panels. It's all very qualitative data, more and less and relative and so on. But it's absolutely possible to get quantitative. And I'm going to use an example of General Mills and their Nature Valley bars that I think illustrates that point really nicely. So you may have seen ads in recent years. Nature Valley had a problem with their granola bars being too crunchy or not crunchy enough. They ran ads where people were sort of breaking the bars on sharp edges of things, and they sort of poked fun at themselves. But it was a real challenge that they were having to get the crunch just right, and they were having unreliable results from their sensory panels to try to figure that out. So their worldwide innovation network, GWIN, went out and found this inventor, Mark is his name, and he had developed something they called an organoleptic analyzer, literally a machine to analyze the organoleptic or experiential qualities of foods. And they brought him in as an independent consultant, and they had him go through a couple iterations of prototyping, and he built them a quantitative crunch analyzer. Now, I scoured the world because I wanted to find you guys a picture of what that actually looks like so we could all imagine it together. None such. It's definitely a tightly protected secret. But it's absolutely possible to go out and get quantitative data about these very qualitative things like crunch and mouthfeel and so on. The second piece, the centralized data platform, this is where we are going to lean most heavily on other industries. So if you think about trying to centralize your data, you want to go from this terrible awful that we talked through a few moments ago to something more centralized, like the logistics and information modeling system that goes into building a skyscraper as efficiently as possible. And if I were to design a centralized data platform for food innovation, this is what it would look like. It would take the quantitative sensory data we just discussed needing to build, add to that quantitative techno-functional ingredient data, how do your ingredients actually behave in food production processes in those food products, packaging data and regulatory compliance data, what needs to go on the label, often that's very interrelated, your strategic marketing imperatives, what are your consumers doing, what is the consumer intel telling you that you need to be developing in the direction of, And then finally, for the ambitious among you, the supply chain data, maybe it's from a blockchain that you're building, maybe it's your own internal logistics, so that all the pieces of your organization can understand what goes into decision-making together. And if we want to talk about how then to enact the third piece, which is really the hardest and the most important, but also the easiest to ignore, mining the existing portfolio, this is where we're going to take that system that we just built and use it to drive value from what we've already spent so much time and effort to build. So for example, if you go through the arduous exercise of gathering that quantitative techno-functional ingredient data, you can make better decisions about formulating and reformulating existing products. So let's use a hypothetical example where you're trying to develop a food product, whether it's an ice cream, whether it's a granola bar, and you have the question of which oil you're going to be using in your formulation. So you have access to a relatively low-cost soybean oil, and you're having trouble getting anything identity preserved, so it can't have a non-GMO label on it, but it's cheap and it's there. Or you have a higher cost peanut oil that's identity preserved, it's non-GMO because there's no such thing in a peanut. You have these decisions that you need to make that are going to balance what are your consumers demanding, what do you have access to in your supply chain, and then those quantitative bits like what is the gelling temperature of those different oils and how does that relate to the cold chain or lack thereof that you'll need for the product as it comes to market. So maybe it's going to be a refrigerated product, and the fact that soybean oil is still liquid at that refrigerated temperature that you'd be using, but peanut oil would be gelled and solidified, that's going to be a very relevant piece of information when your formulation team tries to communicate to your cold chain team about how that product needs to get to market, and so on. Having all of this data centralized so that you can mine that information, and you don't need to go looking for a whole different oil source, you can identify within your own portfolio what ingredient could slot in as a replacement. As you think about how to structure that techno-functional ingredient data, this is where I'm going to encourage you to learn the easy way, what other industries have had to learn the hard way. So in the materials world, as some of my colleagues have been and will continue to talk about, there's a concept, materials informatics. Identifying relationships between materials, processes you can put those materials through, and the products at the end and how they behave. And my recommendation to you is as you think about building this data for food ingredients, just swap out the word ingredient for material and think about building ingredient, process, product relationships. How does a given oil, sweetener, protein, fiber, put through a certain process, freezing, baking, grilling, boiling, how does that contribute to a final product in terms of quantitative parameters, as well as experiential parameters, which hopefully you're getting started working on quantifying, as I pointed out. I hope I'm convincing you as we go along this is a data problem. Everything we've talked about so far comes back to data and is solvable with a better data strategy, better data gathering, better data management, better data use. I'd like to talk about a couple of examples of this starting to happen in the wild. Chef Watson, which is a project undertaken by IBM. This is a coincidence, by the way, that this is included. This is not a plug, I swear. Chef Watson takes centralized data on ingredients and extracts recipes. Sometimes it's a reimagining of an existing or famous recipe. Sometimes it's something entirely de novo and of Watson's own creation. I had intended to look up a Watson recipe, make it, and then share photos and talk about how great it was and so on. And then the suggestion that Chef Watson gave me was this combination, which I realize is probably hard to see in the back, but it's strawberries, king salmon, acacia honey, and bourbon. Now, I love bourbon, and the thought of someone defiling bourbon with salmon and strawberries and honey just makes me cringe. So I didn't make the recipe. And I think instead of an example of a system that's there and ready and so on, I think it's a good example of how even in the system I'm proposing, you're still going to need a human in the loop. You still need a person who can look at that sideways and go, ooh, I don't know if I would put salmon and strawberries together. I think it's a good approach. I bet they're working on refining some of this. But I think it's an interesting idea of how we can use data, use existing data, and mine it for insights like how to combine things in new and different ways. Because it's possible that I'm wrong and this is delicious. And if anyone would like to undertake it and send me a photo along with your review, I would really be curious. I'm still not going to try it. Another example comes to us from Chile, where a small startup called the Knot Company, they go by Notco for short, is using artificial intelligence and a massive library that they've collected of quantitative techno-functional ingredient data to build animal-free versions of familiar animal-based products like milk, like mayonnaise, and so on. I think this is a really exciting example of using that quantitative data and using data science capabilities to actually make things better in a new and exciting way. I have not tried these products, so I'm not sure how good they are, but this company has a lot of momentum, and we think they look pretty promising. In both of these cases, they're taking this issue on as a data problem and making a data solution. Now, we've talked a lot about a big, bold future, and it's going to take a lot of big, bold ideas and doing to get out there to that different way of thinking, to that ingredient informatics approach. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that that's all there is to do and sort of say, good luck, get out there and just do it. I'd like to also help with a little bit of how to start getting a handle on the data that you do need. So what can we do to apply Luxs' approach to this diet ice cream brain freeze? If I could go in my Wayback Machine and go back to before Halotop was an issue, could I have made recommendations to Unilever, based on what we do here at Luxs, to help make a little better process for them here? So let's take just a first look here at how could we find leading indicators. Now, you probably, if you have attended the previous sessions today, you will have heard some of my colleagues talk about the Luxs Tech Signal. It's a way of combining multiple data sets, including funding and patents and so on, to calculate a composite of the innovation interest in a given technology area. And if you want to hear more about that, I'm not the person to talk to, but we certainly have those folks all around the room. If we look at the Luxs Tech Signal for sugar reduction on your left, you'll see that it's been an issue for at least the last 10 years with a varying degree of interest overall, but generally increasing momentum in the space for most of the last decade. So we would certainly have advised a Unilever, for example, that this was an area that was worth attention. If we look more closely on the right at individual artificial sweeteners, you'll see that these have been really hard problems to solve with waxing and waning levels of interest. And if you look at the delta between that total line and the individual sweeteners, you'll see that there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot more to sugar reduction technology innovation than just these individual sweeteners. And this is where the insight comes in. And this is where our food and nutrition team of experts built an assessment of artificial sweeteners and sugar reduction technologies. And they made a composite scoring system to look at how each of those sweeteners can perform in relation to sugar at the top at a score of 5. And what we found is that most sweetener technologies, most artificial sweeteners or sugar reduction tech, doesn't score very well. And if you look at where it sits on its stage of development, the ones that are better are earlier stage for the most part. So the recommendation would have been there's not a good solution in any one alternative sweetener today. What you're going to need to do is come up with a blend in the short term and then work to advance the development of those higher scoring sweeteners that are earlier stage in the longer term. And if you look down on the side there, you'll see the Halotop icon. They're using a combination of erythritol, which is usually used to sweeten gum, and stevia. It's not the recommendation I would have made. The recommendation I would have made would be to use something like a very early stage but very promising approach like a silica sugar crystal, some sort of physical modification of the sucrose structure itself to reduce the calorie content, and then something like stevia, which can impart more of that high-intensity sweetness. So that's the blend I would have recommended. So that's how we deal with the lagging indicator piece, is by getting some leading indicators. The next question is, you're not going to develop everything in-house, so how could we make a recommendation about who you could work with, where you might find that innovation, how many rocks do you need to turn over before you're going to find just the right person? And to answer that question, I would recommend a data-centric approach. So rather than going on gut and who you know and who was invested in by which VC and so on, I would recommend using tools like the Luxs Innovation Grid, which ranks companies based on their technology their technology value and their business execution. And then something like a market map to help identify who has expertise in which areas. So for example, the sugar silica crystal I had mentioned in the earlier composite scoring system, the one developer we're aware of doing something like that, Duxmatalk, shows up in the high potential quadrant on this Luxs innovation grid. They're a very prime potential partner that I would have recommended to Unilever as someone who was early stage, but through some investment and some collaborative work, could have a really promising technology brought to readiness more quickly. That's how we would use a data-centric approach to help evaluate potential collaborators. Now, if we want to put that all together, for those of you who saw Kevin C's talk earlier this morning, he talked about the what, the who, and the when. My hypothesis is that in the food world, it should be the what, the who, and the how, because the time is always now. Your consumer is always changing their mind. There's always something new and different. The time is, it's never a question of when. The question is how. The what we can solve by looking at those leading indicators like the Luxs tech signal. The who, as I hope I showed you, we can solve with things like the Luxs innovation grid and going data forward. And finally, for the how, that's where you're going to need that ingredient informatics strategy. You're going to need to get to quantitative data, centralize it so your teams can actually genuinely work together, and then mine that portfolio for as much value as you can squeeze out of it. And I want to leave you with this parting thought. Let's imagine that Michael from The Good Place asked this question. Using this data-driven strategy, what is there that you can ruin just a little bit so that your consumers will want to have more of it? So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.